Picture this. You're standing in your childhood backyard, surrounded by the people who raised you, and the one person whose approval you've chased your entire life just told 50 people that you'll never amount to anything. Your cheeks are burning, your heart is racing, and you're wondering if maybe he's right. Maybe you have been fooling yourself. Maybe you really are just a dreamer who will never be important enough to matter. Then you hear the sound of engines. Multiple engines. Black SUVs turning onto your quiet suburban street, and everything you thought you knew about your worth, your work, and your place in this world is about to change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I've always believed that the people who love you the most can also hurt you the deepest. My name is Jessica Miller, and I spent the first 32 years of my life trying to prove to my father that I was worth something. That my dreams weren't just foolish fantasies, that a girl from a working-class family in Youngstown, Ohio, could actually make a difference in the world. Growing up in a house where practical trumped passionate every single time, I was the daughter who always had her head in the clouds. While my brother Jake learned to fix engines and talk shop with Dad, I was the one reading about government policies and dreaming about changing laws that could help families like ours. I was the one who believed that maybe, just maybe, someone like me could have a voice that mattered. But belief and reality are two very different things. When you're raised in a family that measures success by the calluses on your hands and the dirt under your fingernails. I was the soft one, the impractical one, the one who thought she could solve the world's problems from behind a desk instead of getting her hands dirty with real work. My father, Robert Miller, was a man who commanded respect everywhere he went. 43 years as a union foreman at the steel plant had taught him that actions spoke louder than words, that honest work was the only work that mattered, and that dreamers like his youngest daughter were setting themselves up for disappointment in a world that didn't care about their fancy ideas. Every conversation we had felt like a test I was destined to fail. Every achievement I earned felt diminished by his gentle but persistent reminders that I was living in a fantasy. He never said he didn't love me, but he made it crystal clear that he didn't understand me, didn't respect the path I'd chosen, and didn't believe that anything I did would ever truly matter. I became the daughter who apologized for taking up space, who downplayed her accomplishments, who spent years trying to translate her work into language he might finally approve of. But no matter how hard I tried to prove that my contributions had value, I remained the family member whose career was a mystery, whose success was questioned, and whose importance was perpetually in doubt. The thing about growing up feeling invisible is that you start to believe you actually are. You begin to question whether your work matters, whether your voice has value, whether you're just kidding yourself about making any real difference. You start to shrink yourself to fit other people's limited vision of who you're supposed to be. But sometimes, life has a way of showing you exactly how wrong everyone else has been about your worth. Sometimes the universe conspires to remind you that the person you've been quietly becoming is far more powerful than anyone ever imagined. And sometimes that reminder comes in the form of a motorcade pulling up to your childhood home while your entire family watches in stunned silence. This is the story of how I stopped apologizing for dreaming big and started owning the space I'd earned in rooms where decisions that affect millions of people get made. This is about learning that your value isn't determined by other people's ability to understand your work, and that sometimes the most important validation comes from the most unexpected places. It's about discovering that the little girl who used to hide in her room reading about policy and politics wasn't naive or foolish. She was preparing. And when the moment came to prove that her dreams were worth something, she was ready. My father always said that real work produces real results that real people can see and touch. He wasn't wrong about that. He just never imagined that his daughter's real work would touch the lives of hundreds of thousands of people across Ohio, or that the results would be measured in new jobs, rebuilt communities, and restored hope for families just like ours. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really begins. In a childhood where being different felt like being wrong, where dreaming big felt like setting yourself up for failure, and where a young girl learned to believe that maybe she really wasn't important enough to matter. The Miller family lived by certain unspoken rules. Work hard, stay humble, don't get above your raising, and never forget where you come from. These weren't bad values, they were survival. Values for a working-class family in a city where the main industry was slowly dying, and good jobs were becoming harder to find each year. My father had built his identity around being reliable, practical, and respected by the men who worked alongside him every day. He was the guy other people came to for advice about everything from union negotiations to buying a house to raising kids. His word carried weight in our neighborhood, and his approval meant everything to the people who knew him. Then there was me, the daughter who wanted to go to college instead of getting a job right out of high school. The one who talked about studying political science while her friends were getting married and starting families. The one who seemed determined to complicate her life by chasing careers that her father couldn't understand, respect, or even explain to his friends when they asked what his daughter did for a living. I wasn't rebelling against my family's values, I was expanding them. I believed that helping people didn't have to mean working with your hands, that making a difference could happen in meeting rooms and legislative chambers, that someone from our background could have a voice in the decisions that shaped our community's future. But believing it and proving it are two entirely different challenges. Every family dinner became a subtle reminder that I was the oddball, the one whose choices didn't make sense, whose success was theoretical rather than tangible. My brother Jake's overtime pay was real money that bought real things. His promotion to shift supervisor was a concrete achievement that everyone could understand and celebrate. My internships and academic honors were just steps toward a future that remained mysterious and possibly worthless. The gap between my father's world and my aspirations felt impossible to bridge. He measured value by immediate, visible impact. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was learning to think in terms of long-term policy changes that might take years to show results. He respected people who solved problems with their hands and their experience. I was drawn to solving problems through research, analysis, and coalition building. Neither approach was wrong, but they seemed fundamentally incompatible when filtered through the lens of family expectations and working-class values. I began to feel like I was betraying my roots by pursuing work that my father couldn't see, understand, or respect. But what I didn't realize then was that I wasn't abandoning my family's values. I was extending them into spaces where they'd never had representation before. I wasn't forgetting where I came from. I was carrying those experiences into rooms, where policy decisions got made by people who had never lived them. Every late night spent studying wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about gaining the credentials and knowledge I'd need to be taken seriously when I advocated for communities like mine. Every internship wasn't just resume building. It was learning how government actually works, so I could navigate it effectively on behalf of people who didn't have access to those systems. I was becoming the bridge between my father's world and the political institutions that affected his life every day. But bridges are only valuable when both sides recognize their worth, and I was still years away from that recognition. The irony is that everything my father taught me about persistence, integrity, and fighting for what's right became the foundation for everything I accomplished in my career. His values shaped my approach to public service, even when he couldn't see the connection between the lessons he'd taught me and the work I was doing. He believed in standing up for working people. I just learned to do it in different rooms. He believed in fighting for fairness and dignity. I just learned to do it through policy and legislation. He believed in building something that would last. I just learned to build it through institutions and programs rather than steel and concrete. The day would come when he'd finally understand that his daughter hadn't abandoned his teachings. She'd amplified them. But first, we'd both have to survive years of mutual frustration, missed connections, and the growing distance between a father who measured success by his standards and a daughter who was quietly creating her own. Robert Miller wasn't just my father, he was a force of nature in our community. Standing 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by decades of physical labor, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every ounce of respect he commanded. His hands told the story of his life, scarred and calloused, from working with steel, machinery, and the 1,000 small injuries that come with jobs where one mistake can cost you a finger or worse. When Dad walked into O'Malley's tavern after his shift, conversations would pause as heads turned his way. Men 20 years younger would nod respectfully and make room at the bar. The bartender would already be reaching for his usual beer before Dad even ordered. He was the kind of man other men looked up to, someone whose opinion carried weight because he'd proven himself through action rather than words. At the steel plant, Dad's reputation was legendary. He'd started on the floor, at 18, straight out of high school, and had worked his way up through every position in the mill. He understood every process, every machine, every safety protocol that kept his crew alive and productive. When management tried to cut corners or implement policies that would endanger workers, Dad was the man who stood up in meetings and explained exactly why their plans wouldn't work. His union leadership wasn't just a title, it was a calling. Dad genuinely believed that working people deserved dignity, fair wages, and safe conditions. He'd spent years negotiating contracts that protected his crew's jobs and benefits. He'd walked picket lines in the dead of winter when negotiations broke down. He'd been arrested twice for blocking trucks during strikes, and he wore those arrests like badges of honor. But Dad's worldview was shaped by tangible results and immediate consequences. When he negotiated a contract, workers got more money in their paychecks the following week. When he fought for safety improvements, fewer people got hurt on the job. When he stood up to management, his crew could see the direct impact of his actions in their daily working conditions. Politics, to Dad, was a different animal entirely. Politicians were people who made promises they didn't keep, who lived in comfortable offices while making decisions about industries they'd never worked in. He'd watched as trade policies negotiated by people who'd never set foot in a steel mill had cost hundreds of his friends their jobs. He'd seen environmental regulations written by bureaucrats who didn't understand the economic realities of industrial communities create compliance costs that drove businesses overseas. In Dad's experience, political people were either naive, idealists who didn't understand how the real world worked, or calculating opportunists who said whatever they thought would get them elected. Neither category included people he trusted to actually solve problems or help working families. So when his youngest daughter announced she wanted to study political science, Dad saw it as a phase she'd outgrow once she realized how the world actually operated. When I insisted on pursuing internships in government offices instead of looking for real jobs, he figured I'd learn my lesson the hard way. When I graduated and started working as a legislative aide, he assumed I'd eventually get tired of the low pay and lack of concrete achievements and find more practical work. What Dad couldn't see was that his own values had shaped everything about my approach to public service. His belief in fighting for working people had taught me that good policy should protect and empower families like ours. His commitment to honest dealing had shown me the importance of building trust through consistent actions rather than empty promises. His willingness to stand up to powerful interests when they threatened his crew had demonstrated the courage required to advocate for unpopular but necessary changes. My brother Jake understood Dad's world intuitively because he'd chosen to live in it. After high school, Jake had joined the plant just like Dad hoped he would. He'd married his high school girlfriend Sarah, bought a modest house in the same neighborhood where we'd grown up, and started a family. Every decision Jake made reinforced Dad's belief that the best path forward was the path he'd already traveled. Jake wasn't trying to outshine me or make me look bad, but his life choices created a constant contrast that highlighted how different my trajectory had become. When Jake got promoted to shift supervisor, it was easy for Dad to understand and celebrate. When Jake bought a new truck or took his family on vacation, the connection between his hard work and his rewards was obvious. Meanwhile, my achievements seemed abstract and disconnected from any tangible benefits. I could explain that my research on workforce development was helping to shape state policy, but what did that actually mean in terms of jobs created or families helped? I could describe the legislation I'd helped draft, but when would those bills actually become law, and how would anyone know if they worked? Dad wasn't being deliberately dismissive. He was genuinely confused about what I actually did all day and whether any of it mattered to real people facing real problems. His questions weren't meant to hurt me, though they often did. He was trying to understand how my work connected to the practical challenges that dominated his world. The generational divide made things even more complicated. Dad had grown up in an era when career paths were straightforward and stability was the highest goal. You found a good job with benefits, you stayed loyal to your employer, and you worked hard until retirement. The idea of changing careers multiple times, pursuing advanced degrees that might not lead to specific jobs, or working in fields that didn't exist when he was young, was completely foreign to his experience. But it wasn't just generational differences that created tension between us. Dad's skepticism about politics was rooted in real experiences of betrayal and disappointment. He'd seen too many politicians promise to protect manufacturing jobs only, to vote for trade deals that moved those jobs overseas. He'd watched as economic development programs brought consultants and meetings to our region, but somehow never seemed to produce the new industries or opportunities they promised. From Dad's perspective, I was joining a system that had repeatedly failed people like us. No matter how good my intentions were, he believed that political institutions were designed to serve wealthy interests and maintain existing power structures rather than create meaningful change for working families. His resistance to my career wasn't personal, it was protective. Dad didn't want to see his daughter invest years of her life and thousands of dollars in education for work that would ultimately disappoint her the way politics had disappointed him. He was trying to save me from what he saw as inevitable disillusionment. But what Dad didn't realize was that his own experiences had taught me exactly why political engagement was necessary. Every story he told about corporate executives making decisions that hurt workers had convinced me that working people needed stronger representation in government. Every example of bureaucratic indifference he shared had shown me the importance of having people in government who understood the real-world impact of policy decisions. I wasn't naive about the limitations and frustrations of political work. Dad's skepticism had actually prepared me for many of the challenges I'd encounter. But unlike him, I believed that the system could be changed from the inside by people who brought different experiences and values to government service. The tragedy was that Dad and I were fighting for the same things through different methods. He used union organizing and direct action to protect workers' rights and improve their conditions. I was learning to use policy analysis and legislative advocacy to achieve similar goals. We both believed in dignity, fairness, and opportunity for working families. We just disagreed about the most effective ways to create change. Dad's influence on my political development was far greater than either of us realized at the time. His stories about workplace safety violations had taught me about the importance of strong regulatory enforcement. His descriptions of contract negotiations had shown me how economic policies affected real families. His examples of community, solidarity during strikes had demonstrated the power of organizing people around shared interests. Everything I learned about coalition building, strategic thinking, and principled advocacy came directly from watching Dad navigate union politics and workplace conflicts. He was actually an incredibly sophisticated political actor. He just didn't recognize his skills as political because they operated outside the formal structures of government. The irony was that Dad would have been an excellent policymaker if he'd been interested in that kind of work. His practical experience, his understanding of how decisions affected workers, and his commitment to honest dealing were exactly the qualities that government needed more of. But his distrust of political institutions and his satisfaction with the direct impact of union work meant he'd never consider crossing over into the world I was entering. So we remained locked in a cycle of mutual misunderstanding. Dad couldn't see how my work connected to his values, and I couldn't figure out how to explain the importance of long-term policy development to someone who measured success by immediate, tangible results. We were speaking different languages, even though we shared the same fundamental beliefs about justice, fairness, and the dignity of work. This dynamic shaped every conversation we had about my career for years. Dad would ask polite questions about my job. I'd try to explain what I was working on, and we'd both walk away feeling like the other person just didn't get it. He thought I was wasting my talents on work that didn't matter. I thought he was refusing to understand the value of what I was trying to accomplish. Neither of us was entirely right or entirely wrong, but our different perspectives made it impossible to find common ground. Dad's opposition to my career path wasn't malicious, but it was persistent and painful. Every family gathering included subtle reminders that my work was theoretical, while Jake's was practical, that my achievements were hard to understand while his were obvious, that my future was uncertain while his was secure. The pattern started early and repeated itself with devastating consistency throughout my childhood and young adulthood. Every family milestone became an opportunity to reinforce the hierarchy of importance in our household, and I consistently found myself at the bottom of that hierarchy. Elementary school parent-teacher conferences were a perfect example. Jake's teachers would rave about his athletic abilities, his leadership on the playground, his natural charisma that made other kids want to follow him. Dad would beam with pride as they described Jake as a born leader who would probably captain the high school football team someday. When it was my turn, teachers would use words like studious, responsible, and well-behaved. They'd mention my excellent grades and perfect attendance, but somehow those achievements felt smaller, less exciting, less worthy of celebration. Dad never said my academic success didn't matter, but his body language told a different story. He'd nod politely when teachers praised my reading level or math skills, but his face would light up when they talked about Jake's potential in sports. Even at 8 years old, I could sense the difference in his enthusiasm, the way my accomplishments earned approval while Jake's earned genuine excitement. Middle school brought the science fair, and I spent weeks researching renewable energy sources and their potential applications in industrial settings. I'd chosen the topic partly because I hoped it might connect to Dad's world of manufacturing and energy consumption. My project won second place at the regional level, earning me a small trophy and recognition in the local newspaper. Dad attended the awards ceremony and clapped politely when my name was called. But when Jake scored his first touchdown of the football season 2 weeks later, Dad called half the neighborhood to share the news. The difference in reactions wasn't lost on me. Academic achievements were nice, but athletic achievements were worth celebrating. High school guidance counselors became another battlefield for competing visions of my future. When I expressed interest in advanced placement courses and talked about college applications, Dad would sit through meetings with barely concealed skepticism. He'd ask practical questions about costs and career prospects that made it clear he thought I was overreaching. Meanwhile, Jake's meetings focused on which colleges might offer him football scholarships. Even though his grades were mediocre and his prospects for playing at the college level were realistically limited, Dad treated those conversations like strategic planning sessions for Jake's inevitable success. The summer before my senior year, I got a part-time job at the local library while also volunteering for a voter registration drive. I was earning minimum wage and learning about civic engagement, skills that would prove invaluable in my later career. Jake worked construction with one of Dad's friends, earning twice what I made and developing skills that Dad could easily understand and value. Every dinner conversation that summer reinforced the same message. Jake would talk about the houses they were building, the techniques he was learning, the practical skills he was developing. Dad would offer advice about tool maintenance and construction best practices, clearly enjoying the opportunity to mentor his son in work he understood. When I'd try to share what I was learning about local government or voter outreach, Dad would listen politely, but his responses were always tinged with skepticism. He'd ask questions like whether anyone was actually registering to vote, as if my efforts might be completely pointless. He'd wonder aloud whether the people running the registration drive had real jobs, or if they were just playing politics. College applications revealed the depth of Dad's reservations about my academic ambitions. When I received acceptance letters from several universities, including a partial scholarship to Ohio State, Dad's first reaction was to calculate the total cost of my education rather than celebrate my achievement. He'd spread financial aid documents across the kitchen table and point out how much debt I'd be taking on, how uncertain my job prospects were, how long it would take to pay back student loans on a government salary. His concerns weren't unreasonable, but they felt like arguments against pursuing my dreams rather than practical planning for achieving them. When Jake decided to skip college and go directly into full-time work at the plant, Dad's relief was obvious. No debt, no uncertainty, no risk of disappointment. Jake would start earning good money immediately, learn valuable skills, and build seniority in a secure union job. From Dad's perspective, Jake was making the smart, practical choice while I was gambling with my future. My college years created even more distance between Dad's world and mine. When I'd come home for holidays and try to explain what I was studying, Dad would listen with the patient expression of someone humoring a child's elaborate fantasy. Political science courses, internship opportunities, research projects, academic conferences, they all seemed equally foreign and impractical to him. Meanwhile, Jake was thriving in exactly the environment Dad understood. He'd been promoted twice, bought his first car, started dating seriously. His life was progressing along, predictable lines toward recognizable goals. Marriage, home ownership, family, financial stability, everything was falling into place according to a blueprint that Dad had followed himself. My path looked chaotic and risky by comparison. Unpaid internships, part-time jobs, graduate school, applications, student loan payments. None of it seemed to be leading toward anything concrete or valuable. I was accumulating credentials and experiences that Dad couldn't evaluate, working toward career goals he couldn't understand, investing time and money in preparation for opportunities that might never materialize. The contrast became especially stark during my junior year when Jake got engaged to Sarah, his high school girlfriend. The engagement party was a celebration of everything Dad valued: young love, family traditions, clear intentions, a future that made sense. Everyone could understand what Jake and Sarah were building together and why it was worth celebrating. That same semester, I'd been selected for a competitive internship with a state legislator's office, an opportunity that could open doors to the kind of career I wanted. But when I tried to explain why this internship was important, Dad's questions focused on the lack of pay and the uncertain job prospects rather than the valuable experience I'd be gaining. Even our family's response to world events reflected these different priorities. When manufacturing jobs started disappearing from our region due to global economic changes, Dad and Jake would discuss the immediate impact on their workplace and community. Their conversations were grounded in practical concerns about layoffs, plant closures, and families losing their livelihoods. I'd try to contribute by discussing policy responses like workforce retraining programs or economic development initiatives, but my perspective was dismissed as theoretical. Dad would point out that policy solutions took years to implement while families needed help immediately. He wasn't wrong, but his dismissal of longer-term thinking felt like another rejection of my approach to problem-solving. Graduate school deepened the divide even further. While Jake was settling into married life and building equity in his first home, I was accumulating more debt to pursue a master's degree in public administration. Dad couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily extend their education beyond what was necessary to get a job. When I try to explain that advanced education was essential for the kind of career I wanted, Dad would point out that some of the most successful people he knew had never set foot in a college classroom. He'd mention business owners who'd built companies through hard work and practical experience, supervisors who'd been promoted based on their performance rather than their degrees. His examples weren't wrong, but they missed the point that different careers required different preparation. You couldn't become a policy analyst through on-the-job training the way you could become a skilled tradesperson. The work I wanted to do required understanding complex legal frameworks, research methodologies, and institutional processes that could only be learned through formal education. But Dad's resistance wasn't just about education. It was about risk tolerance and life philosophy. He believed in taking safe, predictable paths that led to secure outcomes. I was choosing uncertainty and complexity, investing years of my life in preparation for work that might not even exist by the time I was qualified to do it. Every career milestone I achieved seemed to confirm Dad's skepticism rather than challenge it. When I graduated with my master's degree, he attended the ceremony but seemed more interested in calculating how much the whole process had cost than celebrating my accomplishment. When I got my first job as a legislative aide, his questions focused on my salary and benefits rather than the opportunity to contribute to important policy work. The most painful part was that I could see Dad's love and concern underneath his skepticism. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to protect me from what he saw as inevitable disappointment. But his protection felt like opposition. His practical concerns felt like lack of faith in my abilities. His questions felt like challenges to my judgment and decision-making. Years of this dynamic had taught me to downplay my achievements and defensive about my choices. I'd learned to expect skepticism rather than support, to justify my decisions rather than celebrate my successes, to translate my work into language that might seem more practical and valuable to Dad's way of thinking. But translation only works when both parties are genuinely interested in understanding each other. Dad's questions often felt more like cross-examination than curiosity, more like attempts to prove his point than efforts to learn about my perspective. I started sharing less about my work and my goals, knowing that every conversation about my career would require defending choices I'd already made and couldn't change. The irony was that Dad's values had profoundly shaped my approach to public service, even though he couldn't see the connection. His commitment to fighting for working people had taught me to focus on policies that would help families like ours. His integrity in union negotiations had shown me the importance of honest dealing in political work. His willingness to stand up to powerful interests had demonstrated the courage required to advocate for unpopular but necessary changes. But values and methods are different things, and Dad couldn't bridge the gap between his union organizing and my policy work. He couldn't see that we were fighting for the same things through different means, that my education and career were tools for advancing the same principles he'd taught me through his example. The moment that nearly broke me happened 3 years ago, during what should have been a celebration. I'd just been promoted to Senior Policy Advisor for the Ohio Department of Commerce, a position that put me at the center of economic development discussions that could affect hundreds of thousands of working families across the state. The promotion represented everything I'd been working toward since college. I'd finally reached a level where my research and recommendations could influence major policy decisions. I was earning a salary that, while not impressive by private sector standards, was enough to pay off my student loans and start building some financial security. Most importantly, I was positioned to work on exactly the kinds of issues that had motivated me to enter public service in the first place. I was so excited to share the news with my family. For once, I had an achievement that seemed substantial, enough that even Dad might appreciate its significance. A senior position in state government, working on economic development in a state where manufacturing jobs were disappearing and communities were struggling to adapt to changing economic realities. I'd planned to announce the promotion during our traditional Sunday dinner, when the whole family would be gathered around Mom's dining room table. Jake and Sarah would be there with their baby daughter Emma, creating the kind of warm family atmosphere that made good news feel even better. The dinner started perfectly. Mom had made Dad's favorite pot roast. Jake was entertaining everyone with stories about Emma's latest developmental milestones, and Sarah was sharing updates about her part-time job at the elementary school. The conversation was relaxed and affectionate, exactly the environment I'd hoped for when sharing my big news. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, I took a deep breath and announced my promotion. I explained that I'd been selected for a senior advisor position that would allow me to work directly on economic development policies. I described how the role would involve analyzing the impact of different initiatives on working families and rural communities. Mom's face lit up with pride and excitement. She immediately started asking questions about my new responsibilities and congratulating me on the recognition. Sarah joined in with enthusiasm, asking about the promotion process and what the new job would involve. Even Jake seemed genuinely pleased, offering to take the family out for drinks to celebrate. But Dad's reaction was different. He listened to my explanation with a neutral expression that gradually shifted to barely concealed skepticism. When I finished describing the promotion and its significance, he took a sip of his beer and looked directly at me. "So let me understand. This," he said in the measured tone he used when he was trying to make a point. "You're now a senior advisor. What exactly do you advise people about?" I tried to explain that I'd be analyzing economic development proposals and helping to shape policies that could bring jobs and investment to communities across Ohio. I mentioned that part of my work would involve evaluating programs designed to help workers transition from declining industries to emerging opportunities. Dad nodded thoughtfully, as if he were seriously considering my explanation. Then he asked the question that felt like a knife to my chest. "And how many jobs have you actually created, Jessica?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I tried to explain that policy work involves long-term planning and that the impact of good analysis might not be visible for years. I described how research and recommendation could influence decisions that eventually led to job creation. But even as I spoke, I could hear how theoretical and indirect my explanation sounded. "I'm not trying to be difficult," Dad continued, his voice getting slightly louder as other family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I'm genuinely curious about what you accomplish in a typical week. Jake here oversees production that creates actual products people buy. Sarah teaches children who learn measurable skills. Your mother manages a household budget that puts food on the table and keeps the lights on. What do you produce?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment and frustration. I tried to explain that preventing bad policies was just as important as creating good ones, that research and analysis saved taxpayer money and improved outcomes even when the work wasn't visible to the public. But Dad wasn't finished. He'd apparently been thinking about this conversation for a while, and my promotion had given him the perfect opportunity to voice concerns he'd been harboring for years. "You know what bothers me most, Jess?" he said, setting down his beer and looking around the table to make sure everyone was listening. "You've convinced yourself that what you do matters, but you can't explain how it actually helps anyone. You're 32 years old. You've been working in government for almost 10 years, and you still can't point to a single concrete thing you've accomplished." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma chose that moment to start fussing, and Sarah quickly excused herself to tend to the baby. Mom started clearing dishes with unnecessary urgency, clearly desperate to change the subject. Jake stared at his plate, obviously uncomfortable but unwilling to defend me against Dad's criticism. But Dad wasn't done. He'd apparently been storing up frustrations about my career choices for years, and this moment felt like his chance to finally express them all. "I've tried to be supportive," he continued, his voice softer, but somehow more cutting. "I've listened to your explanations about policy analysis and strategic planning and all the rest of it. But here's what I see. My daughter has spent her entire adult life preparing for work that doesn't seem to accomplish anything real." He gestured toward Jake, who was still avoiding eye contact with everyone at the table. Your brother gets up every morning and goes to work that produces steel, that builds bridges and buildings and infrastructure that people depend on. At the end of his shift, he can see what he's accomplished. He can drive past construction sites and know that his work contributed to something tangible and necessary. Then Dad turned back to me, and his expression was a mixture of disappointment and something that looked almost like pity. But you sit in meetings and write reports and analyze data, and at the end of the day, what has changed? What have you built? Who have you helped? How would anyone know if you stopped showing up to work tomorrow? I tried to respond, to defend my work and explain its importance, but Dad held up his hand to stop me. I love you, Jessica. I'm proud of your education and your determination and your good intentions. But I'm worried that you've spent so many years convincing yourself that what you do matters that you can't see how disconnected it is from real people facing real problems. The words hit me like physical blows. Everything I'd feared about, my career, every insecurity I'd wrestled with during late-night moments of doubt, was being voiced by the person whose approval I'd spent my entire life trying to earn. Maybe it's time to consider whether all this government work is actually leading anywhere, Dad continued. Maybe it's time to think about finding work that produces results you can see and measure and be proud of. I stood up from the table, so quickly that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I mumbled something about needing to get home early and started gathering my things while Mom tried to convince me to stay for dessert. But I couldn't stay. I couldn't sit at that table pretending that Dad's words hadn't shattered something fundamental inside me. I couldn't make small talk about Emma's sleeping schedule or Jake's latest hunting trip while processing the reality that my own father saw my career as an elaborate exercise in self-deception. I drove home in a blur of tears and rage and crushing self-doubt. Dad's questions echoed in my mind throughout the sleepless night that followed. How many jobs had I actually created? What concrete accomplishments could I point to? How would anyone know if I stopped showing up to work? The promotion that had felt like validation just hours earlier now seemed hollow and meaningless. If I couldn't explain the value of my work to my own father, how could I claim that it mattered to anyone else? For weeks after that dinner, I found myself questioning everything about my career path. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe I had convinced myself that theoretical work was important because I was afraid to test myself in jobs that produced measurable results. Maybe I was hiding behind graduate degrees and government titles to avoid the risk of failing at work that everyone could evaluate and judge. I started looking at private sector job postings, wondering if it was too late to transition into work that Dad might finally respect. I researched corporate training programs that might value my analytical skills, but lead to positions with clear performance metrics and tangible outcomes. The most painful part was recognizing the kernel of truth in Dad's criticism. Much of my work was indeed theoretical and long-term. The policies I helped develop might not show results for years, if ever. The impact of good analysis was often invisible, preventing bad decisions rather than creating obvious improvements. But what Dad didn't understand, what I was only beginning to articulate even to myself, was that someone had to do the theoretical work. Someone had to research the long-term consequences of policy decisions. Someone had to analyze data and build coalitions and draft legislation, even when the results wouldn't be visible until years later. The question wasn't whether my work mattered. It was whether I had the courage to keep doing it without the validation I'd been seeking from Dad. Could I find meaning and purpose in work that he would never understand or respect? Could I measure my own success by standards that had nothing to do with his approval? That conversation forced me to confront the reality that I might never earn Dad's respect for my career choices. He might never understand the value of what I was trying to accomplish. I could spend the rest of my life explaining and justifying and defending my work, and he might still see it as elaborate self-deception. But I also realized that seeking his approval had been limiting my ambitions and undermining my confidence in ways I was only beginning to understand. Every project I worked on was filtered through the question of whether Dad would think it mattered. Every achievement was diminished by my anticipation of his skepticism. It was time to stop measuring my success by his standards and start building a career that reflected my own values and goals. But first, I had to survive the crushing weight of his disappointment and the devastating possibility that the person I most wanted to impress would never see the value in the work I loved most. What Dad didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that while he was questioning the value of my work, I was quietly building something that would eventually touch the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ohioans. While he saw meetings and reports and theoretical analysis, I was actually developing the most comprehensive rural economic development strategy in the state's history. It started 2 years earlier, when I was still reeling from that devastating family dinner. I'd been assigned to a small task force examining why certain rural communities were thriving, while others continued to decline despite receiving similar state resources. The assignment was meant to be a 6-month research project that would produce a report with recommendations for improving existing programs. But as I began traveling to small towns across Ohio, interviewing families whose lives had been upended by plant closures and farm failures, I realized that the problem was far more complex than anyone at the state level understood. The communities that were succeeding had found ways to leverage their unique assets and build partnerships that transcended traditional political and economic boundaries. The ones that were struggling were trapped in cycles of dependency on industries and institutions that no longer served their needs. My official assignment was to document best practices and identify policy recommendations. But what I actually discovered was that rural economic development required a completely different approach than anything the state had attempted before. Instead of trying to attract outside investment with tax incentives and subsidies, successful communities were building from within. They were identifying local assets, developing local leadership, and creating local solutions that could be scaled and replicated. I began spending my weekends driving to small towns throughout Ohio, conducting informal interviews with farmers, business owners, community leaders, and families who were finding ways to thrive despite economic challenges that had devastated their neighbors. I wasn't being paid for this additional research, and it wasn't required for my official assignment, but I was learning things that no policy analysis could capture. In Barnesville, I met a group of former coal miners who had started a cooperative solar installation business, using skills they'd developed in industrial work to build the clean energy infrastructure their community needed. In Wilmington, I discovered how a group of unemployed auto workers had partnered with local farmers to create a food processing facility that served markets throughout southwestern Ohio. These success stories shared common elements that weren't captured in any of the state's existing economic development frameworks. They involved partnerships between groups that traditionally didn't work together. They required patient, long-term investment in local capacity building rather than quick fixes or outside solutions. They demanded leaders who understood both the practical challenges facing their communities and the complex regulatory and financial systems that could support or hinder local innovation. Most importantly, they demonstrated that rural communities had assets and capabilities that traditional economic development approaches consistently overlooked. Instead of treating these communities as problems to be solved by outside experts, successful development strategies treated them as partners with valuable knowledge and resources that needed different kinds of support. As my research expanded, I began developing relationships with community leaders, university researchers, and nonprofit organizations who were working on similar challenges throughout the Midwest. I discovered that Ohio's rural communities were facing the same pressures as communities in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Indiana, but that very few states were taking comprehensive approaches to rural development. I started attending conferences and workshops on economic development, often paying my own expenses because they weren't directly related to my official job responsibilities. I connected with researchers at Ohio State University who were studying agricultural innovation and rural entrepreneurship. I reached out to community development corporations in other states that had successfully implemented programs I thought could work in Ohio. Slowly, I began to see the outlines of a development strategy that could address the root causes of rural economic decline rather than just managing its symptoms. Instead of trying to recreate the industrial economy that had supported these communities in the past, this approach would help them build new economic foundations that leverage their existing assets while preparing them for future opportunities. The strategy would require unprecedented coordination between state agencies that had never worked together effectively. It would demand new funding mechanisms that could support long-term capacity building rather than short-term job creation. It would need leadership development programs that could prepare local people to navigate complex systems and advocate for their community's needs. Most challenging of all, it would require elected officials and agency leaders to adopt longer-term thinking about economic development, measuring success by community resilience and self-sufficiency, rather than just job creation numbers and investment attraction. I began drafting what would eventually become a 200-page comprehensive rural development plan, working on it during evenings and weekends while fulfilling my regular job responsibilities during business hours. I wasn't sure whether anyone would ever read the plan or whether it would influence actual policy, but I couldn't stop working on it. The more I learned about successful rural development strategies, the more convinced I became that Ohio was missing enormous opportunities to support community-led innovation. We were spending millions of dollars on programs that produced modest results because they were based on outdated assumptions about how economic development worked. But developing a better strategy was only half the challenge. The other half was building the political and institutional support necessary to implement it. Rural development touched on the responsibilities of at least 6 different state agencies, none of which had strong incentives to coordinate their efforts. It required cooperation between labor unions, environmental groups, and business organizations that traditionally viewed each other with suspicion. I began reaching out to potential allies in each of these sectors, sharing research findings and asking for feedback on policy recommendations. I organized informal meetings between community leaders and state officials who had never talked to each other before. I wrote op-eds for rural newspapers, explaining how state policies affected local development efforts and what changes could improve outcomes. This coalition-building work was completely outside my official job description, but it was essential for creating the political foundation that would be necessary if my policy recommendations were ever going to be implemented. I was learning lessons about stakeholder engagement and political strategy that no graduate school course had taught me. The breakthrough came when I realized that rural development couldn't be separated from broader conversations about manufacturing, competitiveness, and workforce development. The same communities that had lost manufacturing jobs also had the land, infrastructure, and workforce that could support new kinds of manufacturing that were emerging around renewable energy, advanced materials, and precision agriculture. Instead of treating rural development as a separate policy area, I began framing it as manufacturing policy for the 21st century. This approach made my work relevant to labor unions worried about membership decline, business groups interested in workforce development, and environmental organizations focused on clean energy transition. I spent months developing economic impact analyses that demonstrated how rural development investments could create manufacturing jobs, strengthen supply chains, and reduce carbon emissions while supporting community self-sufficiency. I identified federal funding sources that could leverage state investments, turning modest initial expenditures into major development programs. The more comprehensive my analysis became, the more ambitious my recommendations grew. What had started as a simple review of existing programs had evolved into a complete reimagining of how Ohio could approach economic development in communities that had been written off by most policymakers. I was proposing a $50 million pilot program that would support community-led development initiatives in 12 rural counties. The program would provide technical assistance, loan guarantees, and workforce development funding, while requiring communities to develop comprehensive economic strategies that addressed their unique assets and challenges. But the real innovation was in the program's structure. Instead of requiring communities to compete against each other for limited resources, the program would encourage collaboration and resource sharing. Instead of imposing standardized solutions, it would provide flexible support that communities could adapt to their specific circumstances. Most importantly, the program would be designed to build local capacity for long-term self-directed development, rather than creating dependency on state resources. Communities would receive intensive support for the first 3 years, moderate support for the next 2 years, and then transition to self-sufficiency with ongoing access to technical assistance and networking opportunities. The financial modeling alone took me 6 months to complete. I had to analyze the economic impact of similar programs in other states, project job creation numbers that would satisfy legislative oversight committees, and demonstrate return on investment calculations that would justify the initial expenditure. Every assumption had to be documented. Every projection had to be conservative enough to be credible, but compelling enough to generate political support. But the real work was happening in communities themselves, where I was spending every weekend building relationships with the people who would ultimately determine whether any policy initiative could succeed. I drove thousands of miles across Ohio, attending town halls and Chamber of Commerce meetings and church potlucks, listening to stories about family businesses that had closed, young people who had moved away, and dreams that had been deferred as economic opportunities disappeared. These conversations taught me things that no economic data could capture. I learned about the informal networks that kept rural communities functioning when formal institutions failed. I discovered how zoning regulations written for urban areas created barriers to rural innovation. I understood why workforce development programs designed by urban planners often missed the mark when implemented in small towns. Most importantly, I learned that successful rural development required deep understanding of local culture, relationships, and decision-making processes. Policies that worked in Columbus or Cleveland might fail completely in communities where personal relationships mattered more than formal credentials, where trust was earned through consistent actions over time, and where outside experts were viewed with healthy skepticism. I began incorporating these insights into my policy recommendations, creating implementation strategies that respected local autonomy while providing necessary resources and support. Instead of imposing standard procedures on all participating communities, the program would allow each community to adapt guidelines to their specific circumstances and priorities. This flexibility made the program more complex to administer, but more likely to succeed in diverse communities with different assets, challenges, and development goals. Some communities might focus on agricultural innovation and food processing. Others might emphasize manufacturing modernization or tourism development. Still others might pursue strategies that combined multiple approaches. The key was providing communities with technical assistance and funding flexibility that allowed them to pursue their own visions rather than conforming to predetermined templates. This approach required more sophisticated program management and evaluation metrics, but it was the only way to support authentic community-led development. As the program design became more detailed, I realized that implementation would require building entirely new partnerships between state agencies, universities, nonprofits, and community organizations. No single institution had all the capabilities necessary to support comprehensive rural development. Success would depend on creating collaborative networks that could provide technical assistance, workforce development, business incubation, infrastructure planning, and policy advocacy. I spent months mapping these potential partnerships, identifying organizations that shared common goals but had never worked together before. I organized pilot projects that demonstrated how different types of organizations could collaborate effectively on specific development initiatives. The most successful pilot involved partnering Youngstown State University's Business Development Center with a community development corporation in Jefferson County to support a group of farmers who wanted to start a meat processing cooperative. The university provided business planning assistance and market research. The Community Development Corporation helped with facility planning and financing. The farmers provided industry expertise and community connections. Within 18 months, the cooperative was processing livestock for farmers throughout eastern Ohio, creating jobs in a rural community that had been losing population for decades. More importantly, the success of this project demonstrated that the collaborative model could work when organizations were willing to focus on community needs rather than institutional priorities. I documented every aspect of this pilot project, creating a case study that could be replicated in other communities with different industries and development goals. The documentation process forced me to identify the specific factors that had contributed to success and the barriers that had to be overcome. These lessons became essential components of the larger policy framework I was developing. Instead of assuming that communities would naturally figure out how to work with multiple partner organizations, the program would provide structured support for relationship building and collaborative planning. But developing effective policy was only one part of the challenge. The other part was building the political coalition necessary to get the policy adopted and funded. Rural development wasn't a high-profile issue that generated significant media attention or grassroots mobilization. Most legislators viewed it as a specialized concern that affected relatively few voters. I needed to demonstrate that rural development was actually central to Ohio's broader economic competitiveness, and that successful rural communities would benefit urban areas as well. This required research that connected rural economic health to statewide outcomes like workforce development, supply chain resilience, and environmental sustainability. The breakthrough came when I realized that many of Ohio's urban manufacturers were struggling to find suppliers for specialized components and materials that could be produced more efficiently in rural areas with lower land costs and available workforce. Rural communities that had lost manufacturing jobs often retained the infrastructure and skilled workers that could support new kinds of manufacturing partnerships. I began developing case studies that demonstrated how rural-urban economic partnerships could strengthen both types of communities while improving Ohio's overall competitiveness. Rural communities could provide specialized manufacturing, food, processing, and logistics support that urban businesses needed. Urban communities could provide markets, technical expertise, and capital that rural businesses required for growth. This framework transformed rural development from a social welfare issue into an economic competitiveness strategy. Instead of asking legislators to spend money helping struggling communities, I was proposing investments that would strengthen the entire state's economy while creating opportunities for communities that had been left behind by previous development strategies. The messaging shift was crucial for building political support, but it also reflected a deeper understanding of how economic development actually worked. Successful regions weren't just collections of prosperous communities, they were integrated economic systems, where different areas contributed different capabilities to shared prosperity. Ohio had never approached economic development from this system's perspective. Most programs focused on helping individual communities compete against each other for limited resources, rather than building collaborative networks that could compete effectively against other regions. My policy framework proposed a fundamental shift toward regional collaboration and shared prosperity. Instead of zero-sum competition between communities, it would create incentives for cooperation and resource sharing. Instead of standardized solutions imposed from Columbus, it would support locally developed strategies that contributed to regional economic resilience. But implementing this vision would require changes to existing state programs, new funding, mechanisms, and unprecedented coordination between agencies that had never worked together effectively. It would demand political leadership willing to take risks on innovative approaches that might not show results for several years. I knew that getting this kind of policy adopted would require more than just good research and compelling arguments. It would require building relationships with elected officials, agency administrators, interest group leaders, and community advocates who could champion rural development as a legislative priority. I began reaching out to state legislators who represented rural districts, sharing research findings and asking for feedback on policy recommendations. I discovered that many of them were frustrated by the limitations of existing development programs but had never seen comprehensive alternatives that addressed the root causes of rural economic decline. Several legislators agreed to sponsor legislation that would create a pilot version of the rural development program I was proposing. But they warned me that getting funding would require demonstrating broad political support from constituencies that didn't traditionally work together on economic development issues. I spent the next year building that coalition, organizing meetings between labor unions and environmental groups, business organizations and community advocates, urban legislators, and rural mayors. These conversations were often difficult because different groups had different priorities and different definitions of successful development. But gradually, I found common ground around shared interests in job creation, environmental sustainability, and community self-sufficiency. Labor unions wanted programs that would create good-paying jobs with benefits and advancement opportunities. Environmental groups wanted development strategies that didn't depend on polluting industries or unsustainable resource extraction. Business organizations wanted workforce development and infrastructure improvements that would support long-term competitiveness. Community advocates wanted development approaches that respected local autonomy and built on existing assets rather than imposing outside solutions. All of these goals were compatible with the rural development framework I was proposing, but achieving them would require more sophisticated and collaborative approaches than anyone had attempted before. The coalition building process taught me as much about politics and policy implementation as my research had taught me about economic development. I learned how to find shared interests between groups that had traditionally viewed each other as opponents. I discovered how to frame policy proposals in language that resonated with different constituencies without compromising core principles. Most importantly, I learned that effective policy advocacy required patient relationship building and trust development that couldn't be rushed or forced. Coalition members needed time to understand each other's priorities and develop confidence that collaboration would serve their interests rather than compromise them. By the time I was ready to present my rural development proposal to senior leadership at the Department of Commerce, I had already built significant support from stakeholders who would be essential for successful implementation. Labor unions had endorsed the workforce development components. Environmental groups supported the clean energy and sustainable agriculture elements. Business organizations appreciated the focus on competitiveness and innovation. Community leaders from rural areas across Ohio had provided feedback that improved the policy design and agreed to serve as pilot sites if funding became available. University researchers had committed to providing technical assistance and evaluation support. Nonprofit organizations had identified complementary programs that could leverage state investments. The proposal I submitted wasn't just a policy document. It was the foundation for a collaborative network that was ready to begin implementation as soon as political approval and funding could be secured. Every recommendation was backed by research, but also by relationships with people who understood how the recommendations would work in practice. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the political landscape would shift in ways that made comprehensive rural development a state priority. The governor had been facing increasing pressure to address job losses in manufacturing communities, and traditional economic development strategies weren't producing the results that voters expected. My proposal arrived at exactly the moment when political leaders were looking for innovative approaches that could demonstrate quick wins while building long-term economic resilience. The comprehensive research, detailed implementation plan, and broad stakeholder support positioned rural development as a solution that could address multiple political challenges simultaneously. But I was still completely unprepared for the call I received on a Tuesday morning in early June, when the governor's chief of staff asked if I could meet with Governor Thompson the following week to discuss implementation timelines and budget requirements for the Rural Development Initiative. After 3 years of working nights and weekends on research that most people assumed would never influence actual policy, I was suddenly being asked to present my recommendations directly to the person who could turn them into reality. The girl who had been told she'd never be important enough to matter was about to sit down with the most powerful elected official in Ohio to discuss a program that could affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. But first, I had to survive my mother's birthday party, where my father would once again remind me that my work didn't accomplish anything real or measurable, where I'd have to smile politely while he questioned the value of everything I'd been building for the past 3 years. What Dad didn't know was that in less than a week, I'd be discussing implementation strategies with Governor Thompson. What he couldn't see was that his daughter had quietly become one of the state's leading experts on rural economic development. What he couldn't imagine was that the work he dismissed as theoretical analysis was about to become a $50 million state program that would bring jobs and opportunity to communities, just like the one where he'd spent his entire life. The irony was devastating and perfect. The man who had taught me to fight for working families couldn't recognize that his daughter had spent years developing tools to do exactly that. The father who valued practical results over theoretical knowledge didn't realize that his daughter had created something that would produce more concrete benefits for more working families than any union contract he'd ever negotiated. But that recognition was still days away. First, I had to endure one more family gathering where my career would be treated as an elaborate exercise in self-deception, where my achievements would be dismissed as irrelevant, where my importance would be questioned by the person whose approval I'd spent my entire life trying to earn. The distance between Dad's perception of my work and its actual significance had never been greater. In less than a week, I'd be meeting with the governor to discuss a program that could transform rural communities across Ohio. But at Sundays, Cookout. I'd still be the daughter whose job nobody could understand, whose contributions nobody could measure, whose importance nobody could see. That gap between perception and reality was about to close in the most dramatic way possible. But for now, I had to focus on preparing for the most important meeting of my career, while pretending that my father's doubts about my work didn't still have the power to shake my confidence in everything I'd built. The June air was thick with humidity and the smell of charcoal smoke when I pulled into my parents' driveway for Mom's 60th birthday celebration. Cars lined both sides of the street, overflow from the backyard party that had been planned for months. I could hear laughter and music drifting from behind the house, the sounds of a family gathering in full swing. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering courage for what I knew would be another afternoon of deflecting questions about my career and enduring subtle reminders that my work didn't measure up to real accomplishments. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant confirming that all the materials for next week's meeting with Governor Thompson were prepared and ready for final review. The irony wasn't lost on me. In 5 days, I'd be presenting the most important work of my career to the person who could transform it from research into reality. But today, I'd be defending that same work against family members who couldn't understand its value or significance. I grabbed the bottle of wine I'd brought for Mom and walked toward the backyard, steeling myself for conversations that would require explaining my job without revealing the confidential nature of the governor's. Upcoming announcement: the policy work that had consumed my life for 3 years would have to remain secret for just a few more days. The backyard was exactly as I'd expected. 3 generations of Miller family members and neighbors scattered across the lawn, clustered around picnic tables laden with covered dishes, cold beverages, and Mom's famous chocolate cake. Dad was holding court near the grill, spatula in hand, regaling his union buddies with stories I'd heard a dozen times before. Mom spotted me immediately and rushed over with the kind of enthusiastic hug that made me remember why family gatherings were worth attending despite their complications. She looked radiant in her new sundress, clearly delighted that so many people had come to celebrate her milestone birthday. "Jessica, I was starting to worry you'd gotten stuck at work," she said, linking her arm through mine and steering me toward the nearest group of relatives. "Come say hello to everyone. Aunt Patricia has been asking about your new position." I spent the next hour making rounds, accepting congratulations on my recent promotion, and fielding the usual questions about what exactly I did for the state government. I'd developed standard responses that satisfied people's curiosity without getting into details that would invite skepticism or detailed follow-up questions. Jake and Sarah arrived fashionably late with 18-month-old Emma, who immediately became the center of attention as she toddled around the yard distributing hugs and charming everyone with her growing vocabulary. Watching Dad's face light up as he swung his granddaughter around reminded me of everything that was good about our family, even when our relationships were complicated. The afternoon progressed predictably. Dad told stories about the good old days at the plant while his friends nodded appreciatively. Mom orchestrated the serving of dinner with military precision, ensuring everyone had enough food and that conversations flowed smoothly between different groups. Jake and Sarah tag-teamed child management while catching up with relatives they hadn't seen in months. I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythms of family gathering, enjoying conversations with cousins about their jobs and relationships, helping Mom organize leftover food, and playing peekaboo with Emma when she needed a break from all the adult attention. For a few hours, I forgot about the tension that usually characterized my interactions with Dad. We were just a family celebrating Mom's birthday, sharing food and stories, and the comfortable intimacy of people who had known each other forever. The shift happened gradually, as these things often do. Uncle Tony asked about my promotion, which led to questions about my responsibilities, which inevitably led to the familiar territory of explaining why my work mattered when its impact wasn't immediately visible or easily understood. "So you write reports about economic development," Tony said, nodding thoughtfully. "And those reports influence policy decisions that eventually create jobs." I confirmed that his understanding was basically accurate, though simplified. I mentioned that my work involved analyzing different approaches to rural development and making recommendations about which strategies were most likely to succeed. "That sounds important," my cousin Michelle offered supportively. "Economic development affects everyone, right?" Before I could respond, Dad's voice carried across the yard from where he'd been monitoring the conversation while pretending to focus on grilling burgers. "The question isn't whether it sounds important," he said loudly enough that nearby conversations paused. "The question is whether it actually accomplishes anything." I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied these moments when Dad decided to publicly challenge the value of my career. But this time, I also felt something else, a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly how much my work had accomplished, even if I couldn't yet share those details. "I think Jessica's work is fascinating," Sarah said diplomatically, clearly, trying to redirect the conversation before it became uncomfortable for everyone present. But Dad was apparently in the mood for one of his teaching moments, the kind where he used my career as an example of how people could convince themselves that meaningless work was important. "Don't get me wrong," he continued, setting down his spatula and turning to face the group that had gathered around our conversation. "I'm sure Jessica works hard and means well, but here's what I don't understand. How do you measure success in a job like that?" He gestured toward Jake, who was bouncing Emma on his hip while trying to stay out of the conversation. "When Jake finishes a shift at the plant, he can point to the steel his crew produced that day. When Sarah finishes teaching a lesson, she can see whether her students learned the material. When I negotiate a union contract, workers get more money in their paychecks." Dad's voice grew stronger as he warmed to his theme, clearly enjoying the opportunity to make his point in front of an audience that included several people who worked in similar practical professions. "But Jessica writes reports that other people who write more reports that eventually might influence someone else to make a decision that could possibly create jobs someday. How many layers of bureaucracy have to approve her recommendations before anything real happens?" The yard had grown quiet except for Emma's babbling and the sizzle of meat on the grill. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd respond to Dad's challenge. Part of me wanted to defend my work with the passion it deserved. Another part wanted to reveal just enough about the governor's upcoming announcement to prove that my work had already accomplished more than Dad could imagine. But I couldn't violate the confidentiality of policy discussions that weren't yet public. I couldn't use inside information to win a family argument, no matter how frustrated I was with Dad's persistent dismissal of everything I'd worked to achieve. "You're right that my work is different from yours," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "The results aren't as immediate or as visible, but that doesn't mean they're not real." Dad shook his head with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child who refused to understand. "Jessica, I love you, but you've been saying the same thing for 10 years. Your work will eventually matter. Your reports will eventually influence policy. Your recommendations will eventually create jobs. When does eventually actually arrive?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I felt tears of frustration stinging my eyes as I struggled to find words that could explain the importance of long-term policy development without sounding defensive or theoretical. "Maybe never," Dad continued, his voice softer, but somehow more cutting. "Maybe you've convinced yourself that what you do matters, because admitting it doesn't would mean acknowledging that you've wasted years of your life on work that makes no difference to anyone." The silence that followed was devastating. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as Dad's words settled over the gathering like a heavy blanket. Mom looked stricken, clearly horrified that her birthday celebration had become the venue for this confrontation. Jake stared at the ground, while Sarah bounced Emma more vigorously, trying to distract her from the tension in the adult conversation. But before I could formulate a response, before I could decide whether to defend my work or simply leave to avoid further humiliation, the sound of multiple car engines cut through the afternoon air. Not just one car, but several, moving in careful formation down our quiet residential street. The sound was distinctive and official, the kind of automotive coordination that suggested government vehicles rather than lost party guests. Every head in the backyard turned toward the street as the engine noise grew louder and more purposeful. Through the gaps in the fence, I could see dark sedans with tinted windows slowing down as they approached our house. "What the hell?" Uncle Tony muttered, expressing what everyone was thinking as the vehicles came to a coordinated stop in front of our driveway. My heart started racing for reasons that had nothing to do with Dad's criticism. I recognized the sound and sight of an official government motorcade, but I couldn't imagine why one would be stopping at our house. My meeting with Governor Thompson wasn't until the following week, and it was scheduled to take place at the State House in Columbus. Car doors began opening with the practiced efficiency of professional security teams. Men in dark suits emerged first, scanning the area with the alert posture of people trained to assess threats and secure perimeters. Their presence transformed our suburban backyard gathering into something that felt surreal and vaguely cinematic. Dad's beer slipped from his hand and shattered on the concrete patio, the crash unnaturally loud in the stunned silence that had fallen over the party. Emma started crying, startled by the sudden tension and her grandfather's uncharacteristic clumsiness. Then, from the lead vehicle, a woman stepped out who I recognized immediately, despite having only seen her on television and in official photographs. Governor Sarah Thompson moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention in any room she entered, but her presence in our backyard felt impossible and dreamlike. She was smaller in person than I'd expected, but her authority was unmistakable as she walked up our driveway flanked by security personnel who managed to look both professional and unobtrusive. Her eyes scanned the crowd of stunned party guests until they found me standing frozen near the picnic table. "Jessica Miller?" she asked, with a warm smile that somehow made the surreal situation feel almost normal. I managed to nod, though my voice seemed to have abandoned me entirely. The governor of Ohio was standing in my parents' backyard, asking for me by name, while 50 relatives and neighbors watched in complete bewilderment. "Governor Thompson," I finally managed, my professional instincts overriding my shock. "I wasn't expecting to see you until next week." She laughed, a genuine sound that eased some of the tension that had settled over the gathering. "I was in Youngstown for another event and thought I'd stop by personally. I hope you don't mind the interruption of your family celebration." The governor turned to address the crowd, her politician's instincts recognizing the perfect opportunity to connect with voters in an informal setting. "I'm Sarah Thompson, and I'm here because Jessica has developed something extraordinary that I wanted to discuss with her in person." She gestured to her aide, who handed her a leather portfolio that I recognized as the type used for official government documents. "Jessica's comprehensive rural development strategy is going to be the centerpiece of our economic revitalization initiative. We're planning to announce a $50 million investment in the first phase of implementation." The numbers hit the gathering like physical impacts. $50 million. First phase. Implementation. These weren't theoretical concepts or distant possibilities. They were concrete commitments that transformed everything about how my work could be understood and evaluated. Governor Thompson continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to explain policy in terms that everyone could understand. "Jessica's research has identified specific strategies for helping rural communities build sustainable economic foundations. Her recommendations include workforce development programs, infrastructure investments, and business incubation initiatives that will create thousands of jobs across Ohio." She looked directly at Dad, whose face had gone through several emotions in the span of 30 seconds. "Your daughter has spent 3 years documenting what works and what doesn't in economic development. Her analysis will guide investments that could transform communities throughout Ohio, particularly communities that have been hit hard by manufacturing job losses." The governor's aide opened the portfolio and pulled out documents that I recognized as summaries of my policy recommendations, formatted for public presentation rather than internal government review. "We're talking about programs that will help displaced manufacturing workers transition to new careers in renewable energy, advanced materials, and precision agriculture. Jessica's framework shows how rural communities can leverage their existing assets while building capacity for long-term economic resilience." Dad's mouth was opening and closing without producing sound, like a fish trying to breathe air. The man who had questioned whether my work accomplished anything real was hearing the governor of Ohio describe it as the foundation for the largest economic development initiative in the state's recent history. "Jessica's proposal includes partnerships with labor unions to ensure that new jobs provide good wages and benefits," Governor Thompson continued, apparently unaware of the family dynamic she was inadvertently addressing. She understands that successful economic development has to benefit working families, not just business owners and investors. Uncle Tony stepped forward, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. "Governor, are you saying that Jessica designed this whole program herself?" "Jessica led the research and policy development," the governor confirmed. "She spent 3 years traveling to rural communities, documenting successful strategies, building stakeholder coalitions, and developing implementation frameworks. The program exists because of her vision and her work." She turned back to me, and I could see genuine respect in her expression. "That's why I wanted to discuss implementation timelines in person. We're hoping to launch the pilot program by the end of the year, which means we need to finalize program guidelines and select participating communities within the next few months." The conversation that followed felt like an out-of-body experience. The governor and I discussed policy details while my family and friends listened with varying degrees of comprehension and amazement. She asked about my recommendations for community selection criteria, program evaluation metrics, and stakeholder engagement strategies. I found myself answering her questions with the expertise I'd developed over 3 years of intensive research, explaining complex policy concepts in language that demonstrated both technical knowledge and practical understanding. The work that Dad had dismissed as theoretical analysis was suddenly revealed as the foundation for concrete programs that would affect real people in measurable ways. "We'll need your leadership on this initiative," Governor Thompson said as our impromptu policy discussion concluded. "I'd like to offer you the position of Director of Rural Economic Development, reporting directly to my office. It's a cabinet-level appointment that will give you the authority necessary to coordinate implementation across multiple state agencies." Cabinet-level appointment. The words seemed to echo in the stunned silence that had fallen over the backyard. I was being offered a position that would make me one of the most senior policy officials in state government, responsible for implementing programs that could affect hundreds of thousands of Ohio residents. "I'm honored by the offer," I managed, though part of my mind was still struggling to process the reality of having this conversation in my parents' backyard while relatives and neighbors listened in amazement. "Excellent," the governor said, clearly pleased. "We'll schedule a formal meeting early next week to discuss details, but I wanted to extend the offer personally." She handed me her business card, though we both knew I already had her contact information through official channels. "Congratulations, Jessica. You've created something that will make a real difference in people's lives." The governor spent another 10 minutes mingling with party guests, answering questions about state policy and demonstrating the kind of personal charm that had made her so successful in politics. She complimented Mom on her beautiful garden, discussed manufacturing policy with Dad's union friends, and even took a picture with Emma, who had recovered from her earlier distress and was now fascinated by all the attention. When the motorcade finally departed, leaving tire marks on our quiet suburban street and a crowd of neighbors gathered on sidewalks to discuss what they'd just witnessed, the backyard fell into a silence that felt completely different from the awkward quiet that had preceded the governor's arrival. Dad approached me slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone. The man who had spent the afternoon questioning the value of my work now looked like someone trying to reconcile two incompatible versions of reality. "Jess," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion I'd never heard before. I had no idea. I could have been angry. I could have thrown his words back at him, demanded an apology for years of dismissal and doubt, made him grovel for all the times he'd made me feel small and unimportant. Instead, I saw something in his eyes that I'd been waiting my entire life to see: respect. Not grudging acknowledgement or polite interest, but genuine recognition that his daughter had accomplished something significant and valuable. "I know you didn't," I said softly. "The work I do isn't easy to understand when you can't see the results. But it's real, Dad. It matters." He nodded, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "Cabinet level," he repeated, as if testing how the words sounded. "My daughter is going to be in the governor's cabinet." "If I accept the position," I corrected, though we both knew I would. "Of course you'll accept it," Dad said, his voice growing stronger. "You've earned it. Jesus, Jess, you've been building this for 3 years, and none of us even knew." Mom appeared at my elbow, having waited for Dad and me to finish our conversation before joining us. Her face was radiant with pride and excitement, clearly thrilled that her birthday party had become the venue for such an extraordinary announcement. "I always knew you were special," she said, hugging me tightly. "I just never imagined how special." Jake approached with Sarah and Emma, his expression a mixture of admiration and sheepish embarrassment. My brother, who had always been the family success story, now looked like someone trying to figure out how his little sister had quietly become more accomplished than anyone had realized. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "I never understood what you were working on, but I should have trusted that it was important." "You don't owe me anything," I replied, meaning it. "We all measure success differently. Your work matters too." But even as I said the words, I could feel how completely the family dynamic had shifted. The daughter who had spent 32 Years seeking approval and validation was suddenly the family member whose achievements overshadowed everyone else's. The career that had been treated as a puzzling phase was now revealed as the foundation for historic policy change. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of phone calls and conversations as word spread through our extended family and neighborhood about the governor's visit. Relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years called to offer congratulations. Neighbors stopped by to ask if I remembered them and whether I might be able to help with various issues related to their businesses or community concerns. Dad's transformation was the most remarkable. The man who had questioned whether my work accomplished anything real became my most enthusiastic advocate, explaining to anyone who would listen how his daughter had designed programs that would create jobs throughout Ohio. He called his union buddies to share the news, describing my rural development strategy with the same pride he'd once reserved for Jake's athletic accomplishments. He researched cabinet-level positions online, learning about their responsibilities and importance so he could better understand what I'd achieved. Most importantly, he started asking questions about my work that demonstrated genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. He wanted to understand how rural development programs would help displaced manufacturing workers. He asked about timeline for implementation and metrics for measuring success. He inquired about my role in selecting participating communities and developing program guidelines. For the first time in our relationship, Dad was treating my expertise as valuable knowledge rather than theoretical abstraction. He was seeking my advice on economic development issues that affected his community and his coworkers. He was proud not just of my achievement, but of my competence and my commitment to helping working families. The conversation that had started, with Dad questioning whether my work would ever accomplish anything real, ended with him asking detailed questions about implementation strategies that would affect thousands of Ohio workers. The daughter he'd worried was wasting her life on meaningless bureaucratic work was suddenly revealed as someone whose recommendations would guide $50 million in economic development investments. 6 months later, Dad attended my swearing-in ceremony in Columbus, wearing his best suit and sitting in the front row with Mom, Jake, and Sarah. He brought a camera and took dozens of pictures, clearly determined to document every moment of the ceremony that formally made me a member of the governor's cabinet. The rural development program launched on schedule, beginning with pilot projects in 12 counties that included several communities where Dad's union had members who'd been affected by plant closures and manufacturing job losses. Dad became one of our most effective community liaisons, helping to explain program benefits to workers who were skeptical of government assistance but trusted his judgment about what would actually help their families. Our relationship was completely transformed. The father who had spent years questioning the value of my work became a passionate advocate for the programs I'd developed. He attended community meetings where rural development initiatives were discussed, offering insights about worker perspectives that improved program design and implementation. Most importantly, Dad finally understood that his values had shaped my approach to public service, even when he couldn't see the connection. His commitment to fighting for working people had taught me to focus on policies that would help families like ours. His integrity in union negotiations had shown me the importance of honest dealing in political work. His willingness to stand up to powerful interests had demonstrated the courage required to advocate for necessary changes. The program exceeded every projection we'd made during the planning process. Within 2 years, participating communities had created over 3,000 new jobs while developing local capacity for long-term economic resilience. Workers who had been displaced from manufacturing jobs were being retrained for careers in renewable energy, advanced materials, and precision agriculture. But the real success was measured in restored hope and renewed confidence in communities that had been written off by most policymakers. Families who had been planning to move away were starting new businesses. Young people who had left for opportunities in larger cities were returning to take jobs in industries that hadn't existed when they graduated from high school. The girl who had been told she'd never be important enough to matter had created something that touched hundreds of thousands of lives across Ohio. The daughter whose work had been dismissed as theoretical analysis had developed programs that produced concrete benefits for working families in communities throughout the state. But the most important transformation was personal. I'd stopped measuring my worth by other people's ability to understand my work. I'd learned that validation from the people you love is precious when it comes, but it can't be the foundation for your sense of purpose or your commitment to meaningful work. Your dreams are not too ambitious. Your goals are not unrealistic. Your work matters, even when the people closest to you can't see its value. Sometimes the most important changes happen quietly, behind the scenes, in ways that won't be visible until years later. And sometimes, just when you've given up hope that anyone will recognize what you've been building, a motorcade pulls up to remind you that the work you've been doing in obscurity has actually been changing the world. The little girl who used to hide in her room reading about politics and policy wasn't naive or foolish. She was preparing. And when the moment came to prove that her dreams were worth something, she was ready. Trust yourself. Keep building. The motorcade might be closer than you think. 2 years after the governor's motorcade changed everything, I stood in the conference room of the Ohio Department of Rural Development, a department that existed because of the work I'd done in secret, while my family questioned whether my career had any value. The walls were lined with maps showing the locations of successful program implementations, photographs from community celebrations, and thank you letters from families whose lives had been transformed by opportunities they never thought would come to their small towns. The morning briefing was about to begin, and my team was preparing to present quarterly results that exceeded every projection we'd made during the original planning process. 3,000 new jobs created, 47 new businesses launched, 18 communities that had achieved economic sustainability markers that positioned them for long-term growth without continued state assistance. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the real story of what had happened across rural Ohio. They couldn't quantify the hope that had returned to communities that had been losing population for decades. They couldn't measure the confidence that young people felt about staying in their hometowns to build careers and raise families. They couldn't document the pride that longtime residents experienced as they watched their neighbors succeed in industries that hadn't existed when the program began. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad, who had become one of our most effective community advocates despite having spent years questioning whether my work accomplished anything meaningful. He was attending a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a worker retraining center in Zanesville, where former steel workers were learning advanced manufacturing techniques for renewable energy equipment production. "Packed house today," his message read. "These guys are excited about real opportunities, not just promises. Proud of what you built, honey." The transformation in our relationship had been as dramatic as any policy outcome. The father who had publicly humiliated me at family gatherings now called regularly to share feedback from workers who were participating in program initiatives. He'd become a bridge between state policymakers and the communities we were trying to serve, translating bureaucratic language into terms that working families could understand and trust. More importantly, Dad had finally recognized that his own values had shaped every aspect of my approach to public service. The commitment to fighting for working people that he demonstrated through union organizing had taught me to focus on policies that prioritized family economic security. The integrity he'd shown in negotiations had influenced my insistence on transparent program guidelines and honest outcome reporting. The courage he'd displayed when standing up to management had prepared me for political battles against interests that preferred maintaining existing systems rather than creating opportunities for meaningful change. Our Sunday family dinners had become strategy sessions where Dad would share insights from his community contacts, and I'd explain how policy decisions were made and implemented. Instead of defending the value of my work, I was learning from his practical experience with the people our programs were designed to help. Jake had also evolved in his understanding of how different types of work could create value for working families. My brother, who had followed the traditional path from high school to plant job to family responsibilities, now regularly asked questions about economic development strategies and policy implementation. He'd become curious about how government decisions affected his workplace and his community, recognizing that political engagement could be a practical tool for protecting and advancing worker interests. The success of the Rural Development Program had created opportunities for expanding similar approaches to other policy areas. Governor Thompson had asked me to lead a task force examining workforce development strategies for urban manufacturing communities, applying lessons learned from rural program implementation to different geographic and economic contexts. But the most meaningful recognition came from the communities themselves. Town halls that had once been dominated by frustration and resignation were now focused on strategic planning and collaborative problem-solving. Local leaders who had felt powerless to influence economic trends affecting their areas were now actively engaged in shaping development initiatives and advocating for resources that could support their goals. The program had succeeded because it respected local knowledge and community priorities while providing technical assistance and financial resources that individual towns couldn't access independently. Instead of imposing standardized solutions, we'd created frameworks that communities could adapt to their specific assets and challenges. This approach required more sophisticated program management than traditional economic development initiatives, but it produced better outcomes because local people understood their community's needs and possibilities better than outside experts ever could. Success required patient relationship building, flexible funding mechanisms, and evaluation metrics that captured long-term capacity building, rather than just immediate job creation numbers. The model was being studied by economic development professionals in other states who were dealing with similar challenges related to manufacturing job losses and rural population decline. I'd been invited to present our approach at conferences in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, sharing lessons learned from Ohio's experience with policymakers who were trying to develop their own comprehensive rural development strategies. But replication required more than copying program guidelines and funding structures. It demanded political leadership willing to invest in approaches that might not show dramatic results for several years, stakeholder engagement processes that brought together groups with different priorities and perspectives, and implementation strategies that respected local autonomy while maintaining accountability for public resource utilization. The most difficult aspect of expansion was building the relationships and trust that had been essential for Ohio's success. Community leaders needed confidence that state officials understood their challenges and respected their judgment about potential solutions. Workers needed assurance that retraining programs would lead to real opportunities rather than just additional credentials that might not translate into employment. Business owners needed evidence that government partnerships would support their growth rather than creating additional regulatory burdens. Environmental advocates needed guarantees that economic development wouldn't compromise long-term sustainability goals that were essential for community health and resilience. Creating alignment between these different constituencies required ongoing dialogue, transparent decision-making processes, and program designs that addressed multiple priorities simultaneously. It demanded policy frameworks sophisticated enough to support diverse approaches while maintaining coherent statewide goals and evaluation standards. The work was complex and often frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that my earlier career positions had never been. Instead of writing reports that might influence future decisions, I was implementing programs that were creating immediate opportunities for people who had been overlooked by previous economic development strategies. Every month brought stories of individual success that illustrated why the years of research and relationship building had been worthwhile. Former manufacturing workers who had been unemployed for months were starting new careers in renewable energy installation and maintenance. Young entrepreneurs were launching businesses that served regional markets while creating local employment opportunities. Farm families were diversifying their operations into agrotourism and specialty food production. generating additional income streams that helped them maintain their agricultural operations during challenging economic periods. Small towns were developing downtown revitalization initiatives that attracted new residents and businesses while preserving the character and history that made these communities attractive places to live and work. But individual success stories were just one measure of the program's impact. The more significant achievement was building local capacity for ongoing economic development that didn't depend on continued state assistance. Communities were developing their own leadership networks, technical expertise, and resource mobilization capabilities that positioned them for long-term resilience and growth. This sustainability was essential for creating lasting change rather than temporary improvements that would disappear when state funding ended. The goal was never to make communities dependent on government assistance, but to provide them with tools and resources they could use to create their own economic opportunities. The approach reflected lessons Dad had taught me about the importance of building strength and capability rather than accepting charity or handouts. The best economic development programs empowered communities to solve their own problems rather than creating dependency on outside intervention. 3 years after the governor's surprising visit to Mom's birthday party, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining federal rural development policy. The hearing was an opportunity to share Ohio's experience with national policymakers who were considering legislation that could support similar approaches in other states. Dad accompanied me to Washington, proudly wearing a suit he'd purchased, specifically for the occasion, and carrying a briefcase filled with materials about program outcomes and community feedback. He'd insisted on attending because he wanted to represent the worker perspective on economic development initiatives that actually delivered results, rather than just making promises. His testimony was more powerful than mine because it came from someone who had initially been skeptical about government programs, but had witnessed their practical benefits for families and communities he cared about. Dad spoke about specific workers who had transitioned from declining industries to growing sectors, about communities that had regained confidence and optimism about their futures, about young people who were choosing to stay in small towns because real opportunities existed there. The contrast between his congressional testimony and his dismissive comments at family gatherings just a few years earlier illustrated how dramatically our relationship and his understanding of my work had evolved. The man who had questioned whether policy analysis accomplished anything real was now advocating for federal support of programs based on research and recommendations I'd developed. But the most meaningful recognition came not from political leaders or policy experts, but from a letter I received from Emma Rodriguez, a young woman who had grown up in Chillicothe and returned after college to start a sustainable agriculture business that employed 12 people and served farmers throughout southern Ohio. "I wanted you to know that your program saved my hometown," she wrote. "When I graduated from Ohio State, everyone assumed I'd move to Columbus or Cleveland because there weren't any opportunities in Chillicothe for someone with my education and interests. But the Rural Development Initiative created an environment where I could build the kind of business I'd dreamed about while helping my community develop economic foundations that didn't depend on outside corporations." Emma's story was being repeated across Ohio in communities where the program had supported local entrepreneurship, workforce development, and collaborative planning initiatives. Young people who had been planning to leave their hometowns were finding reasons to stay. Families who had been considering relocation were discovering new opportunities in places they'd never thought would offer professional growth or economic security. The program's success had attracted national attention that created opportunities for me to influence policy discussions at the federal level. I'd been appointed to advisory committees examining agricultural innovation, manufacturing, competitiveness, and workforce development strategies that could be implemented across multiple states. But the most important work remained focused on Ohio communities, where we were continuing to learn about effective approaches to economic development that respected local knowledge while providing resources that individual towns couldn't access independently. Every program implementation taught us something new about community engagement, stakeholder coordination, and outcome measurement that improved our ability to support future initiatives. The girl who had been told she'd never be important enough to matter had become someone whose policy recommendations were influencing economic development strategies across the Midwest. The daughter whose work had been dismissed as theoretical, analysis was now implementing programs that had created measurable improvements in the lives of thousands of working families. But the real transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. I'd learned to measure my own worth by standards that had nothing to do with other people's ability to understand or appreciate my work. I'd discovered that the most meaningful achievements often happen quietly, behind the scenes, in ways that won't be visible until years after the initial work is completed. The validation I'd spent my entire life seeking from Dad had become unnecessary once I understood that my work had value regardless of whether he could recognize it. His eventual recognition and support were wonderful gifts, but they weren't essential for my sense of purpose or my commitment to public service. The lesson applies to anyone who's building something that others don't understand or value. Your work matters even when the people you love most can't see its importance. Your contributions have value even when they don't produce immediate, visible results. Your efforts are worthwhile even when they require years of patient development before their significance becomes clear. Sometimes the most important changes happen slowly and quietly, through accumulated small improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes the people who doubt your work most are the ones who love you most and are trying to protect you from disappointment. Sometimes the validation you think you need is just permission you have to give yourself to keep building something you believe in. The motorcade that pulled up to our family cookout was dramatic and satisfying, but it wasn't the moment when my work became valuable. That value had existed throughout the years when I was researching community development strategies, building stakeholder relationships, and drafting policy recommendations that nobody else understood or appreciated. Recognition is wonderful when it comes, but it can't be the foundation for meaningful work. Purpose has to come from within, from understanding that you're contributing to something larger than yourself, from knowing that you're using your capabilities to create opportunities for people who need them. Trust your instincts. Build what you believe in. Measure your success by your own standards. The people who matter will eventually understand, and the people who don't understand don't get to determine whether your work matters. The little girl who dreamed about changing the world through policy and politics wasn't naive. She was preparing for the moment when she'd have the knowledge, relationships, and opportunities necessary to turn those dreams into reality. Keep building. The world needs what you're creating, even when it doesn't know it yet. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.